A hidden chapter of the Cold War is unveiled as the F-104 Starfighter's clandestine drone operations are explored. The previously untold story of these missions is revealed, captivating those interested in aviation history and Cold War secrets. Intriguing question. What if I told you one of America's most iconic Cold War jets had a secret life? The F-104 Starfighter wasn't just a supersonic interceptor. It was a key player in a covert drone war, a chapter so hidden most historians don't even know about it. Prepare to uncover America's forgotten Cold War drone program. The Cold War produced many secrets, some loudly celebrated in declassified documentaries, and others buried so deeply that even historians, rummaging through forgotten archives, never stumble upon them. But in the vast deserts of the American Southwest, beneath the unrelenting sun and the vibration of distant sonic booms, a story unfolded that history quietly smothered before it could breathe. This is the tale of an aircraft built to break records, transformed into a disposable ghost, and used in a silent battlefield that officially never existed. It is the story of the F-104 Starfighter's second life, one so strange, so unlikely, and so deeply entangled with America's clandestine ambitions that only fragments remain today. To the public, the F-104 Starfighter was a machine of contradictions. Nicknamed the missile with a man in it, it sliced through the sky with razor-like speed, yet carried a reputation for danger that made even seasoned pilots cautious. It was sleek, temperamental, unforgiving, but undeniably extraordinary. The public knew its shape from air shows and military posters, but what they did not know was that some starfighters died twice, once in their pilots' logbooks, and again in a strange, unmanned afterlife where they flew without hearts, without fear, and without any expectation of coming back. This shadowy second career began not with a thunderous launch or strategic doctrine, but with a quiet problem, one that gnawed at the edges of American missile development. As the 1960s unfolded, the United States rushed to build faster, smarter surface-to-air missile systems. The Soviets were doing the same. Both sides were locked in a contest of predictive engineering. If the enemy had a bomber capable of Mach 2, tests required a drone that could do Mach 2. If the enemy could fly at 60,000 feet, tests needed a drone that could reach the same altitude. But disposable platforms capable of such performance simply didn't exist. Target drones were slow, outdated, unreliable. Frankly, they were toys compared to the threats intelligence analysts scribbled in their reports. And so someone, no one remembers exactly who, asked a strange question. Why don't we use retired fighters? At first, the idea seemed absurd. Fighter aircraft were expensive, complicated, and designed for pilots, not remote control systems. But desperation breeds innovation. Soon, desks filled with proposals. Maybe F-100s could be retrofitted. Perhaps older F-86s would suffice. But those aircraft lacked the raw edge needed for the next generation of missile research. What program directors needed was an aircraft that could push the boundaries of heat, altitude, and supersonic maneuvering, something that could challenge cutting-edge interceptors and ground-based defenses. They needed the F-104 Starfighter. By the mid-1960s, many early-model starfighters had already lived hard lives. Some were worn, some obsolete for frontline service, and some dangerously close to retirement anyway. These aircraft, though too risky or outdated for human pilots, still possessed something unmatched: speed. Raw, ferocious, unapologetic speed. They could mimic Soviet profiles better than any drone on the market. And thus began their descent into secrecy. The transformation was unlike anything in aviation history. These were not drones built from scratch. They were living machines, gutted and resurrected with a new identity. Technicians stripped out the ejection seats. They removed non-essential avionics. They rewired the flight controls to respond to remote signals and installed new systems that allowed ground crews to steer the aircraft like radio-controlled beasts. These hybrid creatures became known as F-104's, a designation that quietly encoded their expendability. The first time a fully converted F-104 rolled out onto the sun-baked tarmac at a classified testing strip, it was met with a strange silence. For the technicians and engineers gathered around it, the moment was surreal. To many of them, the Starfighter was an icon, an engineering marvel revered for its speed and adored for its sleekness. Seeing one prepared to fly into harm's way without a pilot felt unnatural, like watching a thoroughbred racehorse marched into a demolition derby. The aircraft, once a proud fighter built around a cockpit, now had no need for a human presence. Its nose, once home to radar screens and a pilot's gloved hands gripping the control stick, was now empty space. Where a heart once beat, a heart of adrenaline, fear, judgment, only wires remained. But the military saw efficiency where the romantics saw tragedy. A drone could push limits that no pilot would dare to attempt. It could fly at speeds that blacked out human beings. It could dive toward missile batteries without flinching, withstand being shot at, or deliberately plunge into no-escape scenarios. As one officer allegedly remarked, the F-104's were not meant to be preserved. They were weapons of experimentation, sacrificial lambs for a new age of warfare. And so they were transported in secrecy to the vast test ranges where America rehearsed the wars it hoped never to fight. The first flights were uneasy. Ground crews stood beside bulky trucks loaded with antennas and consoles, primitive but powerful interfaces through which operators would command the unmanned starfighter. The pilots, stripped now of wings and helmets, became specialists behind rows of screens. Their cockpit was not a cramped space at 40,000 feet, but a trailer with buzzing fluorescent lights. At first, they struggled. The F-104's notorious handling quirks, which had challenged even elite aviators, became doubly difficult to manage through remote inputs. Early test flights produced sweaty palms, near misses, and at least one emergency crash landing that forced engineers to revise entire control systems. But every failure brought refinement. Every stumble sharpened the program. Before long, the F-104's began performing maneuvers that stunned even the men controlling them. One operator recalled that commanding the aircraft felt like trying to steer a razor blade in a hurricane. Another joked that the Starfighter seemed determined to die a dramatic death, no matter who or what was flying it. But in those strange, tense moments, when the drone climbed effortlessly past 50,000 feet, engine glowing white-hot, wings slicing the thin air, something extraordinary became clear. No machine on Earth could replicate what it did. Not then, not for years. America suddenly possessed a test platform capable of simulating the deadliest intercept profiles of potential Soviet fighters, profiles too dangerous for manned testing. It could scream across restricted airspace at Mach 2, twist through evasive patterns, and dive like a spear toward simulated defensive batteries. Missile crews trained on these aircraft as though they were facing a real enemy. And yet, almost none of these missions appear in public record. The secrecy was absolute. Even when an aircraft slammed into the desert after a missile clipped its tail, reports were buried beneath layers of classification. Engineers were instructed to record only essential data. Many were told not to ask questions, and some were told not to speak about their work at all. It wasn't glamorous Cold War espionage. It was simply the quiet machinery of a military establishment that preferred shadows to scrutiny. But silence has weight. and as years passed, the weight grew heavier. Pilots who once flew the F-104 watched the drones from afar, some with fascination, others with profound discomfort. A few confessed that seeing their beloved aircraft turned into targets, literal targets, felt like an insult to the machines they had once trusted with their lives. One retired aviator described the experience bitterly. "We used to salute those aircraft. Now we were shooting at them." But the military didn't see nostalgia. It saw utility. And so the program continued, discreetly swallowing more retired aircraft and feeding them into the furnace of Cold War readiness. Some drones returned from missions intact, ready for another run. Others vanished in plumes of dust and flame. Many died without even a moment of glory, shot down by missile prototypes that themselves would never make it into service. But each sacrifice propelled American missile technology forward. Each loss taught engineers something new. And in this strange cycle of destruction and innovation, the QF-104s carved their place in history, silently, anonymously. By the late 1960s, American missile systems were evolving faster than ever. Each new model demanded faster, more advanced test platforms. The Starfighter, once cutting edge, now stood on the brink of obsolescence even in this secret world. Yet the program persisted, refining tactics, pushing boundaries, learning from each mission. Only decades later, when files were unsealed and forgotten test logs resurfaced, would aviation historians realize they had missed a critical chapter in aerospace evolution. Modern drones, with their advanced flight control systems and autonomous behaviors, stood upon a foundation laid not solely by new technology, but by the sacrificial flights of these repurposed warriors. But at the time, hardly anyone noticed. The world remained focused on nuclear treaties, space missions, political scandals, and visible wars overseas. The QF-104s continued flying their ghost missions across skies that belonged to no one, obeying commands whispered through radio frequencies, performing roles no one acknowledged, and contributing to strategies that would never appear in newspapers. This was not the drone war people imagine today. There were no satellite uplinks, no autonomous algorithms, no stealthy airframes guided by artificial intelligence. This was drone warfare in its infancy, raw, unpredictable, dangerous. A battlefield where machines and men were equally vulnerable, where mistakes were catastrophic, and where success meant complete invisibility. And it all began with a forgotten decision that some aircraft could die twice. By the late 1960s, the QF-104 program no longer resembled a desperate experimental patchwork. It had matured, quietly, methodically, and with the unforgiving discipline typical of Cold War innovation. What began as an improvised solution to a problem no one wanted to acknowledge had grown into a well-oiled operation stretching across multiple secret test ranges. Each location had its own protocols, its own engineers sworn to silence, and its own graveyard of wreckage scattered across remote sands. The desert became both cradle and tomb for these ghost aircraft. From the moment the sun cracked the horizon each morning, the test ranges stirred. Radios snapped alive. Fuel trucks rolled across the tarmac, leaving shimmering trails of fumes in the heavy heat. Technicians in sun-faded uniforms dragged cables, calibrated antennas, and performed meticulous pre-flight checks. In these settings, the QF-104s didn't merely look out of place, they looked eerie. Unlike operational fighters, their canopies were often sealed or replaced. Their cockpits, stripped bare, resembled hollow rib cages inside metallic bodies. Their lifeless interiors were a stark reminder that no pilot would sit inside them again. Some technicians nicknamed them steel ghosts, though others preferred darker labels: suicide birds, lost arrows, or simply the Expendables. But no matter the name, the feeling was the same. These aircraft were different. They didn't taxi with the tense anticipation of a human pilot calculating takeoff speeds. They rolled forward with unnatural calm, as though unaware of the danger ahead. Remote operators, the pilots who never left the ground, occupied cramped control trailers that resembled a hybrid of radar rooms and emergency shelters. The walls vibrated when the Starfighter's engine ignited. The roar of the General Electric J79 engine shook dust from the rafters and rattled mugs on metal tables. But instead of gripping a stick in a cockpit thousands of feet above the earth, these operators sat before flickering screens and analog dials, their fingers dancing across heavy mechanical switches. From this unglamorous environment, they commanded one of the fastest aircraft ever built. And every time a QF-104 roared down the runway to meet its fate, procedures unfolded with almost ritualistic precision. The drone accelerated, the nose lifted, its wheels left the earth, and then an eerie silence. No radio chatter, no pilot breathing into a mask, just the raw howl of a machine with no heartbeat. Once airborne, the QF-104 became a creature of pure command inputs, roll angles adjusted by pulses sent from ground antennas, throttle changes transmitted through radio packets, tight turns executed via remote control with a delay that trained operators to think seconds ahead. Flying a Starfighter manually was already a challenge that required sharp instincts. Flying one remotely demanded a combination of nerve, intuition, and technical mastery. One operator described the experience vividly. It felt like wrestling a tornado while looking through a soda straw. The QF-104 was so powerful, so responsive, and so prone to falling out of the sky from even minor miscalculations that ground pilots developed a kind of reverence for the aircraft. They joked about its quirks, cursed its sudden stalls, and bragged about successful maneuvers. But beneath that humor lay genuine respect and fear. Because unlike human pilots, these remote operators had no ejection seat, no physical sensation of banking or stalling, no instinctive feel for the aircraft's mood. They relied solely on dials, telemetry, and radar tracks. If something went wrong, and it often did, the drone didn't simply wobble or misbehave. It vanished. One moment, a tiny blip on a radar screen. The next, a fiery smear against the desert floor. The loss of airframes became a grim expectation. After each test, technicians waited for word. Did it return or not? If the aircraft disappeared, a handful of men were dispatched to retrieve debris. They wore simple uniforms, drove aging pickups, and carried tools for collecting wreckage. These teams became unofficial chroniclers of the drone war's hidden failures, cataloging shattered wings, ruptured fuel tanks, and blackened fragments of aircraft that once represented the pinnacle of aviation engineering. Some wrecks were intact enough to reveal chilling details. A drone that crashed nose first at near supersonic speeds might leave behind twisted fuselage sections resembling crumpled foil. One that broke apart in mid-air could scatter pieces across miles. Sometimes wreckage was so thoroughly obliterated that retrieval crews found nothing recognizable at all, just scorched earth and fragments embedded in rock. Stories of these missions circulated quietly among personnel. The crash sites were somber places. No bodies, no parachutes, no flare guns, but an undeniable sense of finality. These aircraft may have been drones, but many had once carried real pilots. Some still bore faded markings from their time in frontline squadrons. Their destruction felt different from losing an unmanned prototype. It felt personal.
Still, the program pressed on.
The necessity driving the drone flights was too important to ignore. America needed faster interceptors, more responsive missile systems, and smarter targeting algorithms. The Soviet Union was advancing quickly, fielding new aircraft capable of blistering speeds and altitudes that pushed the limits of radar systems. Intelligence reports warned of theoretical bombers that could outrun or outclimb most American defenses, and so the F-104's became proxies for potential threats, flying profiles designed to mimic enemy tactics. Some missions were straightforward: fly straight and level at high altitude while missile crews tracked and locked onto the drone. Other missions were far more aggressive. The F-104's performed violent turns, steep climbs, and evasive maneuvers that simulated combat scenarios. The ground operators executed sequences that once required elite pilots, all while contending with input delays and the aircraft's notorious sensitivity to angle of attack changes. In one exercise, a F-104 was ordered to simulate a Soviet bomber diving toward a missile battery. As the drone descended at dangerous speed, the operator struggled to maintain control. Telemetry spiked. Alarms lit up across the control trailer. Energy levels soared beyond the aircraft's safety margins. Moments later, the Starfighter's wing ripped away. The aircraft tumbled into a catastrophic spiral and exploded before it hit the ground. No one spoke for a long time in the control room that day. The operator blamed himself, but the engineers insisted it was the aircraft's structural limits. In truth, both explanations were correct. The F-104's were being pushed as far as the earth and sky would allow. The remote pilots learned quickly that precision meant survival, not for themselves, but for the mission. They developed their own techniques and tricks: subtle throttle changes to smooth out oscillations, anticipatory corrections to counter radio delays, and instinctive knowledge of how the Starfighter behaved in specific altitude bands. Some became legends within the program, their reputations built on near-impossible saves or flawlessly executed maneuvers. Others quit, unable to handle the stress of guiding an unmanned aircraft that routinely danced on the edge of aerodynamic catastrophe. Meanwhile, maintenance crews encountered new and unexpected problems. Aircraft designed for human operation began behaving differently when flown remotely. Vibrations rattled components loose more frequently. Control surfaces wore out faster. Hydraulic systems failed in ways never documented during manned flights. Sometimes drones returned from missions with stress fractures no one had anticipated. Other times they returned smoking, barely holding together after pushing into performance envelopes few had imagined necessary. And yet every battered F-104 that rolled back onto the tarmac represented data, a currency more valuable than money, rivaling even classified intelligence. Engineers obsessively combed through flight logs, testing new theories, refining radar systems, and improving missile targeting software. Behind every crash lay lessons. Behind every success lay confidence. And behind every mission lay secrecy. Men working the program were instructed not to discuss details outside their assigned circles. Even within the bases, they referred to missions by vague code numbers. Written documents were stored in locked cabinets and shredded after review. The culture of secrecy was so deeply ingrained that decades later, many technicians remained unsure what parts of their work had ever been declassified. Yet the program survived not because of secrecy, but because of necessity. As the 1970s approached, new missiles like the AIM-7 Sparrow and the early prototypes of long-range ground-based systems demanded ever more realistic testing scenarios. America's defense infrastructure relied on accuracy. A missile that failed during wartime could mean disaster. Therefore, engineers insisted on validation through real, high-speed targets. And so, new batches of retired F-104's were pulled from storage depots, Aircraft that had once prowled the skies of Europe, guarded borders in Asia, or flown in American air defense units. Machines built for daring intercepts and supersonic climbs were now being stripped, repainted, assigned new serial numbers, and rolled into hangars where they would be reborn as drones. For some technicians, the transformation felt poetic. For others, it felt like betrayal. But to the military, it felt necessary, and the QF-104s obliged, entering their final careers with a mix of dignity and tragedy. Over time, remote operators began to form strange emotional attachments to their assigned drones. They monitored their aircraft's quirks, engine tendencies, sluggishness in certain maneuvers, responsiveness during climbs, as though reading personalities into machines. Some gave them names. Others avoided that entirely, believing names made their inevitable destruction harder to stomach. There was one drone known unofficially as Red Widow. It was infamous for its unpredictability. Another, called Ghost 7, displayed unusually smooth flight characteristics, becoming the unofficial favorite of operators who dreaded unpredictable missions. These nicknames never appeared in official documents, but they survived in the memories of those who worked with them. The QF-104s were no longer just machines. They were symbols of a hidden struggle, a quiet war fought not over borders, but over technological superiority. Meanwhile, the outside world remained oblivious. Television viewers never saw footage of supersonic drones streaking across restricted airspace. Newspapers never reported the crashes. Aviation magazines celebrated the Starfighter's frontline service, but ignored its afterlife as a sacrificial test asset. Even pilots who once flew the F-104 in combat roles were rarely informed about the drone program's specifics. The QF-104s existed in a bubble of secrecy, and within that bubble, they helped define the future of warfare. Because the lessons learned from these unmanned starfighter flights were profound. Engineers discovered how radar systems behaved at extreme closing velocities. Missile designers observed terminal phase challenges that only real aircraft could reveal. Interceptor pilots trained against targets that pushed the limits of survivability, preparing them for adversaries that might one day match or surpass the QF-104's speed. Every flight, successful or catastrophic, fed a rapidly evolving understanding of air combat in the missile age. But this progress came at a cost: the slow, steady disappearance of an iconic aircraft. The Starfighter, once celebrated for breaking altitude records and defining futuristic aesthetics, was now quietly burning itself out for the sake of progress. Its image lived on in museums and air shows, but its most important contributions unfolded far away from crowds, across deserts filled with abandoned runways, weather-beaten hangars, and the skeletal remains of aircraft no one would ever properly mourn. It was a strange, lonely war. A war with no flag, no anthem, no medals. A war where the enemy was physics, probability, and evolving doctrine. A war in which death came without human loss, but not without meaning. And though the world didn't know it, the legacy of this war would one day reshape the very nature of aerial combat. The QF-104s were more than drones. They were pioneers. The death of the QF-104 program did not come like an explosion or a crash. It arrived quietly, like a fading echo. One morning, the men at the remote testing bases realized the hangars no longer hummed with the J-79 engine's growl. The flight schedules grew blank. The radio trailers, once alive with the static rhythm of ghost aircraft, stood silent. The desert around them, that eternal witness to secrets, swallowed the stillness without complaint. The F-104 drones had vanished from the skies, but something lingered in the air, a sense that the world had crossed a line without noticing it. The operators, engineers, and commanders who spent years guiding pilotless starfighters into danger understood this better than anyone. They had witnessed the beginning of something monumental, something the world was not yet ready to confront. They had seen machines become soldiers, and they understood that nothing about warfare would ever be the same again. When the final starfighter drone was retired, no official announcement was made. The program was classified, compartmentalized, and sealed behind documentation so obtuse that even authorized officers struggled to decipher it. The U.S. military had plenty of public technology projects to talk about: new fighters, lunar missions, electronic warfare systems, but what happened in the desert remained unspoken. The last F-104 sat in a storage hangar for nearly a year before being dismantled. Its parts were cataloged without ceremony. Some pieces went to scrap. Others were kept in secure vaults for future analysis. The airframe, once sleek and shimmering in sunlight, ended up reduced to metal sheets, wires, and decommissioned systems placed into boxes marked "Do not open without clearance." But even as the machines were scattered and buried, the knowledge extracted from them remained alive in the minds of the people who worked the program. Technicians remembered how shock waves distorted telemetry. Operators remembered how a drone could tumble at Mach 1 without warning. Engineers remembered how a 1950s-era fighter taught computers to understand speed. These memories were never discussed openly, but they shaped careers, influenced breakthroughs, and whispered into future projects like ghosts returning to guide the living. Long before unmanned aircraft became central to modern warfare, long before news anchors said the word drone with casual familiarity, the legacy of the F-104's had begun to seep into unexpected corners of military research. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, engineering teams developing new missile guidance software referenced data logs pulled from the old Starfighter drones, numbers recorded during violent, evasive maneuvers, near stalls at high altitude, and recovery attempts from borderline aerodynamic collapse. These logs help designers teach missiles to think faster, adjust more smoothly, and anticipate enemy maneuvers with greater accuracy. At Edwards Air Force Base, early concepts for autonomous stability control systems borrowed insights from remote operator corrections logged during the F-104's most dangerous missions. The Starfighter's unpredictable quirks had forced engineers to create algorithms that could compensate for sudden attitude changes. Decades later, those same principles would help stabilize modern drones during complex tasks. Even NASA quietly benefited. Aerodynamicists studying high-speed airflow referenced Starfighter telemetry that no civilian project had ever documented. The F-104's had operated in performance envelopes so extreme that their failures provided more lessons than their successes. Engineers learned how wings twisted under stress, how fuselages flexed at supersonic speed, and how sensors misread airflow during shockwave interactions. Some of this knowledge found its way into experimental aircraft research. In these ways, the Ghost Fleet lived on, not as aircraft, but as experience, shaping technologies that would one day define the modern world. The individuals who served in the drone program did not walk away unchanged. Their work left invisible marks on them. Not trauma exactly, but something deeper and more complicated. For remote operators, the shift back into normal life felt surreal. After years spent controlling aircraft that flew beyond the edge of physics, sitting behind a desk or flying a training simulation felt dull. Many compared it to waking from a dream only to discover the real world lacked color. A few left military service altogether, pursuing engineering careers or academic paths. Some joined early UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle development programs in the 1980s, leveraging their hard-earned experience long before the public knew such jobs existed. Others became mentors, guiding a new generation of operators who would one day control drones over foreign battlefields. The older operators never bragged about their past. Their missions were classified, their achievements buried. But when younger drone pilots described the stress of guiding modern aircraft remotely, the veterans simply nodded, understanding something deeper than words could express. The engineers fared differently. Their contribution to the drone program had been intensive, creative, and exhausting. They had resurrected aging starfighters from scrap and converted them into machines capable of defying death, at least for a few missions. Many of them carried pride in what they had built, even if they could never talk about it. One engineer, decades later, summed it up perfectly. "We took an aircraft designed before computers and taught it to think, and then we let it die so future machines wouldn't have to." Commanders, meanwhile, bore the heaviest burden. They had been responsible for keeping the program alive through political challenges, funding shortages, and internal skepticism. They had watched their men struggle with stress, watched drones they had grown attached to fall from the sky, and watched the public remain oblivious to the revolution unfolding in secret. But they also understood something no one else did. They had glimpsed the future. Even though the F-104 program faded into classification, the desert kept its own memories. Some crash sites remained untouched. Some fragments of wings still lay half buried in the sand. Some melted avionics components fused into rock after high-velocity impacts. Visitors, rare, usually unauthorized, sometimes stumbled across pieces of metal twisted into alien shapes. They might think they had discovered the wreck of an experimental aircraft or the remains of a forgotten test. They were partially right. The desert doesn't care about classification. The desert keeps everything. Old-timers who worked the ranges tell quiet stories of how, in the right light, you could still see the faint scorch marks of a supersonic crash. They speak of hangars where, if you stood alone long enough, the wind outside mimicked the rising whine of a J-79 engine preparing for takeoff. These are myths, of course, but every myth has a root in truth. When historians write about the Cold War, they focus on nuclear brinksmanship, espionage, political upheaval, and negotiations that decided the balance of power. But rarely, if ever, does anyone mention the unmanned starfighters that flew in silence across restricted skies. Yet the F-104 program represented a turning point every bit as important as satellite reconnaissance or stealth aircraft. It proved that pilotless machines could perform complex maneuvers, survive high-speed engagements, simulate enemy aircraft, execute dangerous profiles no pilot would attempt, and provide data impossible to obtain otherwise. And most importantly, it proved that machines could take risks humans shouldn't. This realization rewired the very DNA of military thinking. It opened the door to modern drones. It opened the door to autonomous systems. It opened the door to a future where warfare shifted from human endurance to machine precision. If the world ever wondered where the concept of drones truly began, not the hobby-grade models or surveillance aircraft, but the deadly strategic machines that shape modern conflict, the answer lies in those forgotten starfighters. Fast forward to the present. Drones patrol borders, Drones eliminate threats with pinpoint accuracy. Drones conduct surveillance across continents. Drones fight wars without risking a single pilot. Every one of these capabilities owes something to the F-104's. Not directly, modern systems are powered by modern technology, but philosophically, operationally, and historically, the Starfighter drones were the origin. They taught engineers that remote flight at supersonic speeds was possible. They taught commanders that unmanned assets could perform missions previously reserved for pilots. They taught analysts that data collected by expendable aircraft could revolutionize weapon design. They were the spark that ignited a global transformation. Even the culture surrounding modern drone operations, the stress, the precision, the remote nature of combat, echoes the earlier experiences of F-104 operators who learned to fly without touching the sky. Most military aircraft are remembered for their dogfights, their pilots, or the wars they fought in. But the F-104's are remembered, by those who remember them at all, for something far stranger. They taught the world how to fight without a pilot. Their missions were not glamorous. Their deaths were not heroic. Their contributions were not public. But their legacy is embedded in every modern drone strike, every missile test, every autonomous aircraft, and every nation that now relies on machines to carry out missions once considered impossible. A machine cannot win a medal. A machine cannot tell its story. A machine cannot defend its legacy. But people can. And so the story survives, passed quietly among those who worked in shadows, carried forward by engineers who still whisper about the Starfighter that refused to crash, or the drone that broke apart mid-air but changed missile physics forever. In military museums around the world, restored F-104 Starfighters sit proudly behind velvet ropes. Visitors admire their sleek rings, their needle noses, their futuristic lines. They take photographs. They read plaques that describe record-breaking flights and international service. But none of those plaques mention the other Starfighters, the ones that flew without names, without pilots, without recognition. The ones that died alone in empty deserts. These drones were the forgotten brothers of their glamorous counterparts, silent, sacrificial, essential. If one looks closely at a museum Starfighter, one might imagine the ghostly outline of a F-104 flying somewhere nearby, not in the sky, but in memory. A machine that broke itself so other machines could learn. A machine that flew not for glory, but for progress. A machine that paved the way for an unmanned age. The story of America's forgotten drone war is not a tale of heroes in cockpits or enemies shot from the sky. It is a story of machines pushed beyond their limits, and of people who understood that the future demanded sacrifices no human should be forced to make. It is a story of secrecy, innovation, quiet courage, and the unseen hand of progress. Above all, it is a story of transformation, because somewhere in those deserts, during those classified missions, the world began shifting. Warfare changed, technology changed, philosophy changed. And all of it began with a handful of retired Starfighters, resurrected, repurposed, and pushed into a hidden war they were never designed to fight. Today, their legacy flies every time a drone takes off, every time a missile finds its mark, every time a commander sends a machine into danger instead of a human. The F-104's are gone, but their impact is everywhere.